Thank you very much also all of you for joining here. POLIMP indeed will go through it a bit in detail to see what it was about. Some of you that I recognize, a lot of faces have participated in some of our events or have discussed with us in the past, and we really appreciate it. Falling back to our kind words, to the kind words of our officer, of Peter, I have to admit that POLIMP was quite a tough project in the end of the day. And the reason for that is that since it's not a purely research project, meaning that you have you try to develop a strong methodology, and then you bring in very good scientists all together to come up with something new. In fact, here you have a lot of new things coming up, and you try to put them in a normal way that people can understand what is happening. And that's, I mean, the vice versa, the other way. The problem also of that is that we have a lot of different opinions on climate, and you know that's quite a hot debate represented by different stakeholders, and this, in fact, on its own creates a big problem to identify what could be a knowledge that represents, let's say, the average opinion of, and we could provide to the Commission back. Now, I mean, this was one of the main challenges of our project, as I mentioned here, is that there is a lot of information available. And that's how we started already working on the project. We were all quite experts in the field, and we already knew, and we had read a lot of reports, a lot of web pages, a lot of opinions. So there is a lot of information available for climate policy stakeholders, but the way the information is presented is often, first, difficult to access, not in the right format, or of limited use for stakeholders. This is not something that we came up on our own. We carried out a whole survey to understand what are the gaps in knowledge that we have. And the gaps is the way that the knowledge is presented most of the times, and that it cannot be so helpful than what it should be. So, okay, you heard the name, the titles, we don't go through that. These are the institutes that have worked. So all of our colleagues, most of our colleagues are here. You can find them also in the breaks and discuss if you want specific aspects of the group. It was quite a diverse group with mainly from scientific and policy world. Now, what we aimed actually at identified was, first of all, where the knowledge gaps existed, what the future international climate policy direction may look like, and what these imply for policy and decision makers internationally within the EU. These were mainly the three layers, let's say, of work that we tried to carry out. Now, if we go a bit more in the objectives that we had, I would like to start, from what we already had and now what we have already done. So maybe you can cross-compare our rate of success in this sense. So the first one was indeed to identify the knowledge gaps on the implications for the EU stakeholders of possible directions of climate policy making. Through the 3 years program, a lot of changes have taken out in the climate policy, and a lot of processes, documents, legal documents from the Commission within member states. So we try to follow up non-stop the whole process and see what still knowledge gaps there are. Then to collect and synthesize the knowledge of possible climate policy directions and what implications they would have. And then to support policy and decision makers in taking well-informed decisions. This, of course, you can understand, it's the hardest challenge always. You can present the knowledge in the best format you can have, but persuading a policymaker is one step that takes much more work than that. But I have to admit that we managed to attract a lot of policymakers and discuss with a lot of policymakers. So at least we hope that some people might have been aware, let's say, at least of the knowledge we have created on that. Then, what Peter mentioned is how actually to better communicate the knowledge between research and policy. So that's what we also tried to do here. We tried, first of all, to better communicate the knowledge between the various researchers, okay, that were in the field, then within the various stakeholders that have vested interests for or against some aspects of climate policy, and the policy makers as well. And then, of course, we followed up the UNFCCC negotiations. We're all present in the last 3 COPs, and also, in several policy events, on climate policy events in Brussels and in other member states. Okay. Right, then the question why, practically, POLIMP. This goes a bit more in the background of what we faced and what we considered as the problems, let's say, of climate policy knowledge. The first one is that we have a lot of contested political debates. So we have a lot of, there is much at stake for vested interest, individual countries, and the climate issues at the same point. All countries, or we can see even within the EU, that has a voice, several countries might have different opinions on the climate policy at stake, and different vested interests. So we know that bridging these things is quite hard. That's where we hope, that we have contributed a bit in the discussion. Then, the next part we identified is the misinformation on climate policy issues. A lot of debates and biased opinions are there in the air, which might be sometimes not purely scientifically proven. Then, there is richness of information that makes it sometimes difficult to extract essential. I think that's quite clear for all of us. If you have long reports, sometimes quite difficult to understand what is the essence of it. And you might not have even the time or the availability of the resources to keep track of all the knowledge being produced. And of course, the one that was the hardest part of all was the neutrality of the information. That on the climate policy sphere, the information was hardly neutral or used often to specific objectives. And this is why we wanted to have people on board, stakeholders on board, to get as much points and opinions as possible so that we can come to a common understanding of things. And of course, the next part is the too academic sometimes information, which we hope we manage to overcome at some point. Then, this was the Climate Policy Info Hub. This is one of our main tools that we have, that we extract knowledge. I would all welcome you still to have a look, check some articles. They are divided in various sections, like for EU climate policy, international climate policy, emissions trading, renewable energy, etc., etc. So please have a look, comment on the articles, feel free, we are open. And as Peter mentioned before, there is a new Horizon project that is running, the Charisma one, which there is a lot of synergy with this platform, and we will see how probably things can be developed from there. Then, some contributions from our side now. I will just go briefly through that because there are many presentations today, so I don't want to steal moments from my colleagues. Some of the areas that we consider that some contribution was more essential was on the policy implications of the UNFCCC climate negotiations from COP18 to COP28 and for the EU. Then the public acceptance. These were four flagships, let's say, we had. Public acceptance of low carbon technologies and measures, and we'll go through them briefly. Financing, our renewable energy for Europe, and perspectives from the EU ETS. So, going quickly through the first one, for the implications of climate negotiations, we had a barometer, which practically, there was an experts group, of climate policy experts group, which were answering on a monthly, I think, basis, some questions on specific topics. So we tried to estimate, what is more or less the opinion or towards specific issues of climate policy. So this was a POLIMP survey series. I will show them in the end so you can keep track. So it has addressed confidence in climate policy issues among stakeholders. The experts, we can see here, were very optimistic, in principle, after Paris, which the basic conclusion was a significant step forward. Confidence, though, is slowly decreasing, we can see, after Paris. And in the green line, for those who cannot see clearly, is the long-term EU policy confidence. The blue is the EU climate policy economic impact. And the yellow, somehow lends the international outlook. So what partners and what stakeholders are asking, and the experts are asking, is clear policy landscape, meaning more stringent targets, finalize the 2030 strategy, and of course all the parallel, I could say, directives. Energy efficiency directive, renewable energy directive, which all feed into the climate policy sphere. Then, on the public acceptance, indeed we have the possibility for 80 to 95% greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2050. It's technically feasible. We all know that it's technically feasible, and we know that even economically can be feasible, that economic benefits may outweigh the costs. All studies show that. There are technologies who can be cost effective, etc., etc. But what we face is the public opposition, which indeed can delay or obstruct implementation of clean technologies. And the public opposition is not something that is only related to technical issues or economic issues. There are many more issues that we need to take into account when promoting technologies in order to make them accepted publicly. It will be discussed, I think, in the next presentation by our colleagues from CEP. So I will not go through the elements we identified. So all these were presented in workshops, discussed with stakeholders, reports written, so you can have access to that. Then the financing of renewable energy, which is also part. We have the Renewable Energy Directive, which has the ambitious target and the new targets from the Commission. There are support schemes in all EU member states, running from feed-in tariffs now to auctions, now to FIPs, etc., etc. And there are many, of course, renewable energy policies that have weakened or dismantled since the start of economic crisis in 2008. I mean, this was a hard hit for the renewable energy policy, whether we accept it or not. We have seen that things did not really run as they should be running, although we are on a good track. One of the links was whether the ETS or the climate mitigation policy instruments could play a role here to support the renewable energy. One of the issues, for example, that we heard, which was quite flashing, and I would like to mention it here, when we had a lot of people from investment world, let's say, in a conference we had in London, carried by Climate Strategies in this workshop, was that the problem with renewable energy is not the money itself. I mean, the capital is enormous to be invested in the EU on renewable energy, and they gave us some staggering figure, I don't know exactly the number of billions we speak about. And the point is that we don't invest, maybe the capital is too cheap also from their side, so it has never been cheaper with such an interest rate in the EU. So why we don't invest is the regulatory issues in all countries. And the regulatory issues have been affected also by the policy, by the financial crisis, and by RE support schemes, which actually gives a new input that we need to keep in mind. Okay. And then on the stakeholders' perspectives, Peter was faster than me. He informed us about this workshop that I want to mention. It was quite an interesting workshop. We tried to deal with national stakeholders, so we carried out surveys in several member states to identify how various stakeholders within member states consider the EU ETS and the follow-up of the EU ETS and the MSR and all these issues. And of course, you can understand that we had a lot of diverging opinions, different opinions from Poland, for different interests, different opinions from the Netherlands, and we just show briefly here that, for example, for the Polish stakeholders, the price of the EUAs adequately reflects economic crisis and there is no need for interventions. For the Dutch stakeholders, there is the flexibility of allowance supply is needed to increase EUA price and incentive. Just showing here, don't take all this into account. We have for various countries, there are reports for that, so we'll welcome you to go for that. For the MSR, which is the most important step towards the EU ETS, some stakeholders have seen it as a step in the right direction, but most, if not all stakeholders, demonstrate that it's insufficient. Okay. Now, a bit of advertising from our side. This is the policy brief series for these 4 topics we mentioned. You can download the report, so it's a policy briefs directly on each topic, and we have also working documents. You can see the titles of how do stakeholders, for example, view the EU ETS, criteria for evaluating global regime scenarios, publications, briefing notes, thematic briefing notes, newsletters, press releases, scientific publications, etc. Please, everything is available on our website, and I would really like to ask you to have a look, and feel free to comment on that if you have opinions that could be different. Then we have the climate change monitoring series and the survey series. The survey series are the ones I mentioned before. You could consider it as a barometer of how experts group check and have opinion, understand, I mean, the continuation of the climate policy and specific aspect of climate policy. Webinars, this you can watch online. It's on our YouTube channel. Again, on specific topics with top experts. The last one was held yesterday with the great success, as I realize. And I would mainly, just to sum up, because it's a lot of interest here, why, I mean, we consider it, and why I'm glad, I mean, that Peter has somehow confirmed our opinion of POLIMP, is that we actually managed to get a real, actual stakeholder engagement in member states and on the EU level, so on both sides, bringing member states on board and also EU level stakeholders on board, from industry associations, specific industries, etc. Then we managed to present the knowledge in many different formats and access and allowing access by different groups. So the knowledge was tailor-made for specific groups, and we got quite nice comments back on that. Then we hope that we managed to present the essential information on climate policy in unbiased format. So based on facts, as many facts as possible, and far away from lobby interest, as far as possible, of course. Condensed and comprehensive. And this was, as I said, one of the main challenges. And the neutrality, we managed to preserve the neutrality in the sense that we made efforts to engage all stakeholders with different interests, as I said, through the participation in meetings, the expert response groups, surveys with businesses, NGOs, think tanks and governments. I would stop now here. I think it's enough. Thank you all. I hope I did not tire you. It was a main idea of what POLIMP was, what we have done, some main achievements from our side. So feel free to ask questions and also refer to our website and the platform to get all this information which are publicly available. Thank you very much.